Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that's both fascinating and a little bit unsettling.
Yeah.
Microplastics.
Yeah.
They're tiny, they're everywhere, and they're raising a lot of questions about, their potential impact on human health.
Absolutely. And we've got some great sources here to help us unpack
Yeah.
this complex issue. We'll be looking at a detailed review study from the National Library of Medicine,
Okay.
an article from Harvard Medical Magazine,
Cool.
and an overview from the US EPA website.
Perfect. So let's just start with the basics.
Yeah.
What exactly are microplastics,
Yeah.
and why are scientists so concerned about them?
Well, think of them as tiny pieces of plastic debris,
Okay.
ranging in size from like a grain of rice down to something as small as bacteria.
Wow.
And what's fascinating and concerning is that scientists are finding them virtually everywhere, from the deepest ocean trenches to the air we breathe.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, some researchers believe they're so prevalent that they could signify a new geological epoch called the Plasticine,
Okay.
marked by the lasting imprint of plastic on our planet.
The Plasticine. That's pretty sobering thought. Is there any tangible evidence to support this idea?
There is. The scientific study we're looking at actually includes a picture of a canyon in Spain
Oh, wow.
where layers of microplastics are embedded in the rock. It's a stark visual reminder of how persistent these materials are in the environment.
Wow. A permanent layer of plastic in the earth. That's a powerful image. But let's back up a bit. You mentioned that microplastics come in a range of sizes. How do scientists classify them, and what are the different sources of these tiny particles?
Well, microplastics can be broadly categorized as either primary or secondary.
Right.
Primary microplastics are those that are intentionally manufactured, like the microbeads found in some cosmetics,
Right.
or the tiny plastic pellets used in industrial processes.
So those are created with a specific purpose in mind, even if that purpose might ultimately be harmful.
Yeah, precisely. Secondary microplastics, on the other hand, are the result of larger plastic items breaking down over time.
Right.
Think about plastic bottles, bags, fishing nets. All of these things eventually fragment into smaller and smaller pieces,
Oh, yeah.
contributing to the growing pool of microplastics in the environment. And unfortunately, these secondary microplastics are the most common type we find.
Got it. So primary microplastics are intentional,
Yeah,
and secondary microplastics are the result of breakdown.
right.
But with such a vast range of sizes and shapes, how do scientists even begin to study these microplastics? It seems like an incredibly challenging task.
It is. And the fact that microplastics vary not only in size and shape, but also in their chemical composition adds another layer of complexity.
Right.
There's no one-size-fits-all method for collecting, analyzing, and quantifying them in the environment.
It sounds like a scientific puzzle.
Yeah.
But let's delve into why microplastics are raising such alarm bells. Is it simply their presence, or is there something more concerning about these tiny particles?
It's not just their presence. It's what they might be carrying.
Okay.
Microplastics can act as vectors for other harmful substances.
Right.
And we're not just talking about the chemicals used to make the plastic itself, but also environmental pollutants they can absorb from their surroundings.
So it's like they're tiny sponges soaking up all sorts of nasty stuff.
That's a good way to think about it. And this cocktail effect, as it's called, is what's really raising red flags for scientists.
Okay, let's unpack this cocktail. The scientific study mentions a number of additives used in plastic production that have potential human health risks. What are some of the key culprits?
One of the most well-known is bisphenol A, or BPA.
Okay.
You'll find it in polycarbonate plastics,
Okay.
used for things like water bottles and food containers.
Right.
It also shows up in epoxy resins that line cans and jars to extend shelf life.
Okay.
While it's great for keeping products fresh, the downside is that BPA leaches out of these plastics rather easily.
And what are the implications of that?
Well, BPA is an endocrine disruptor.
Okay.
That means it can interfere with your hormones, potentially leading to a variety of health problems.
Right.
Studies have linked BPA exposure to issues like obesity, cardiovascular disease, reproductive problems,
Yeah.
and even breast cancer. One study even estimated that BPA contamination contributed to over 12,000 cases of childhood obesity back in 2008 alone.
That's pretty alarming.
Yeah.
So BPA is definitely something to be aware of. What about those phthalates I've been hearing about? I know they're used to make plastics more flexible, but what are the concerns surrounding them?
Phthalates are another type of plasticizer that are ubiquitous in our environment.
Right.
They're found in everything from toys and food packaging to cosmetics and personal care products.
Yeah.
And just like BPA, some phthalates are endocrine disruptors that have been linked to reproductive and developmental issues.
So yet another potential health concern lurking in these microplastics.
Right.
Seems like they can carry quite a variety of harmful substances.
They can, indeed. And we haven't even touched on heavy metals yet.
Heavy metals,
Mm.
like lead and mercury, are those found in plastics too?
Yes, heavy metals like cadmium, lead, and arsenic are often used in plastic production for various reasons.
Wow.
They might be added as colorants, flame retardants, or stabilizers.
Okay.
But the problem is, these heavy metals can have serious health effects.
I know lead, for example, is particularly harmful for children's developing brains.
Yeah.
What about the other heavy metals you mentioned? What are their specific health risks?
Well, cadmium is known to cause kidney damage and bone problems, while arsenic is a well-established carcinogen.
Wow.
And the fact that these heavy metals are being incorporated into plastics, which then break down into microplastics,
Right.
raises serious concerns about their potential to enter the food chain and ultimately end up in our bodies.
It's a bit unsettling to think about all these potentially harmful substances hitching a ride on these tiny plastic particles.
Yeah.
Are there any other additives we should be concerned about?
There's one more category worth mentioning, flame retardants. They're added to plastics to make them less flammable, which sounds like a good thing on the surface.
Right.
But some of these flame retardants, like PBDEs, have been found to persist in the environment and accumulate in human tissues, including breast milk.
So even though they're designed to make products safer in one way, they might be introducing other risks.
Exactly. And studies suggest that some flame retardants can interfere with hormone function
Right.
and potentially affect brain development and thyroid function.
It's a real catch-22.
Yeah.
So we've established that microplastics are pervasive.
Yeah.
They can carry a whole host of harmful chemicals. And now the big question is, how are they actually getting into our bodies?
Well, there are three main pathways of exposure: ingestion, inhalation,
okay,
and skin contact.
got it.
And unfortunately, it seems like microplastics have found quite a few creative ways to exploit each of these routes.
Okay, let's break those down one by one, starting with ingestion. How will we be consuming these microplastics?
You might be surprised by just how many ways microplastics can sneak into our food supply.
Yeah.
Seafood is a big one, as you might expect.
Right.
But they've also been detected in produce, table salt, and even drinking water.
So even if you're being really careful about what you eat, it's still tough to avoid them completely.
That seems to be the case. One study even found microplastics in sugar, salt, alcohol, and bottled water,
Oh, wow.
highlighting just how pervasive they are in our food system.
Right.
And once these microplastics are in your gut, there's concern that they could potentially transfer from your digestive system into your bloodstream and potentially other organs.
Ugh, that's not exactly appetizing.
Mm-hmm.
What about inhalation? How are these tiny particles getting into the air we breathe?
Think about all the synthetic fibers in our clothes,
Right.
carpets, and furniture.
Okay.
These fibers break down over time, releasing microplastic into the air.
Okay.
They can also become airborne through tire wear,
Wow.
industrial processes, and even just wind blowing over plastic debris.
So every time I do laundry or vacuum, I'm potentially contributing to the problem.
In a way, yes.
Right.
And when we inhale these tiny particles,
Ugh.
especially the smaller ones,
Mm-hmm.
they can lodge in our lungs and potentially enter our bloodstream.
This is starting to feel a bit like a science fiction horror movie,
Yeah.
but at least we're safe from skin contact, right?
Well, skin absorption of microplastics is considered less likely than ingestion or inhalation,
Okay.
but it's still a possibility, particularly when it comes to nanoplastics,
Okay.
the tiniest of the tiny particles.
Nanoplastics, are those even smaller than microplastics?
Yes, nanoplastics are particles smaller than 1 micrometer,
Okay.
which means they're incredibly tiny and difficult to detect.
Right.
And because of their size,
Right.
there's concern that they might be able to penetrate the skin's protective barrier.
And I'm guessing this is especially concerning when you consider all the microplastics found in personal care products like scrubs and cosmetics.
Exactly. So while the science on skin absorption is still developing, it's definitely an area of ongoing research and potential concern.
Okay, so we've established that microplastics are everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
They can carry a range of harmful chemicals,
Right.
and they're getting into our bodies in multiple ways.
Yeah.
The million-dollar question is, what are these microplastics doing to our health?
That's the question researchers are working tirelessly to answer.
Yeah.
And as with many things in science, the answer is complex and nuanced. The research on microplastics and human health is still in its early stages, but scientists are uncovering some potentially troubling findings.
Can you give us an overview of what they've learned so far?
Yeah.
What are some of the key areas of concern?
One major area of focus is on microplastics' potential to cause oxidative stress and DNA damage in cells.
Yeah.
These are known risk factors for cancer.
Right.
So it's an area of significant concern.
So we're talking about potential long-term effects, not just immediate reactions.
Exactly. It's not like you swallow a microplastic and suddenly something dramatic happens. It's more about the potential for cumulative damage over time, especially if these particles are accumulating in our tissues.
That makes sense. Are there any other specific health effects that researchers are investigating?
Some studies have suggested that microplastics could negatively impact reproductive health.
Okay.
Most of this research has been in animal models,
Right.
but the findings raise concerns about potential implications for human fertility.
That's concerning, especially given the ubiquitous nature of these microplastics. Are there any other areas of research you'd like to highlight?
There's growing concern about microplastics' potential to disrupt the gut microbiome. You know, that complex community of bacteria that lives in our digestive system and plays such a vital role in our overall health.
Yes, I've heard a lot about the gut microbiome lately. What's the connection between microplastics and these beneficial bacteria?
Well, some researchers believe that microplastics could interfere with the balance of bacteria in our gut,
Okay.
potentially leading to inflammation, digestive issues, and even impacting our immune system.
It's amazing to think that these tiny plastic particles could have such a far-reaching impact on our health. Are there any other potential risks associated with microplastics that we haven't discussed yet?
Here's a particularly unnerving thought. Some researchers believe microplastics could act as carriers for antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
Oh, wow. That's a whole other level of concern. How could that happen?
Well, think about it. Microplastics are essentially tiny rafts traveling through the environment and
Right.
picking up whatever they encounter along the way.
Yeah.
And if they come into contact with antibiotic-resistant bacteria,
Right.
they could potentially transport those bacteria to new locations, including our own bodies.
That's a scary thought. It almost feels like a perfect storm for a public health crisis.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that research on microplastics is still in its early stages.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the challenges facing scientists who are studying the health effects of these particles?
One of the biggest challenges is simply the sheer diversity of microplastics. As we've discussed, they vary widely in size, shape, and chemical composition,
Right.
which makes it incredibly difficult to study them in a standardized way. It's not like you can just take a microplastic pill and observe the effects.
Right. It's much more complex than that.
Exactly. And beyond that,
Yeah.
there's also the issue of long-term exposure.
Okay.
We've only recently begun to understand the potential short-term effects of microplastics, but we're just beginning to grasp what prolonged exposure might mean for our health. It's a bit like trying to predict the weather years in advance.
Right.
There are so many variables at play that it's hard to make accurate predictions.
And what about the cocktail effect we talked about earlier?
Right.
With microplastics acting as vectors for other harmful substances. Are scientists able to study how those interactions might play out within the human body?
That's another layer of complexity that researchers are still trying to unravel. It's
Right.
challenging enough to study the effects of a single plastic additive in isolation, but understanding how these chemicals behave in combination with microplastics and with each other is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
It's like trying to solve a multidimensional puzzle where each piece influences the others.
So it sounds like there are a lot of unknowns and a lot of research yet to be done.
Yeah.
But what is the EPA doing to address this growing concern about microplastics? Are they taking any concrete steps to protect human health and the environment?
They are. The EPA is investing in research to better understand the risks posed by microplastics,
Okay.
particularly those tiny nanoplastics we were discussing earlier.
That makes sense. What are some of their specific research priorities?
One of their key priorities is developing better methods for detecting and measuring microplastics in the environment.
Okay.
This is a crucial first step because without accurate measurement tools, it's difficult to assess the true extent of the problem and track the effectiveness of any interventions.
So they're working on the foundational tools and knowledge needed to address this issue. What about research on the potential health effects of microplastics? Is the EPA involved in that as well?
Absolutely. They're developing in vitro and computational models to assess the health impacts of microplastic exposure.
Okay.
These models allow researchers to study how microplastics interact with human cells and tissues in a controlled laboratory setting without having to conduct experiments on humans.
It sounds like they're approaching the problem from a variety of angles.
Hmm.
Are there any other areas of research the EPA is focusing on when it comes to microplastics?
Yes, they're also exploring the potential impacts of bio-based and biodegradable plastics.
Okay.
These are often touted as a more eco-friendly alternative to traditional plastics,
Right.
but we need to be sure that they truly break down in the environment and don't pose any unforeseen risks to human health.
That's a good point. We don't want to jump from one problem to another without fully understanding the implications. It's encouraging to hear that the EPA is taking a proactive approach to investigating these alternatives.
I agree. It's essential to approach this issue with a critical eye and to base our decisions on sound science.
Well said. This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive into the world of microplastics. We've learned about what they are, where they come from, how they're entering our bodies, and what scientists are investigating regarding their potential health effects.
Yeah,
It's definitely a complex and evolving issue, but it's one that we can't afford to ignore.
absolutely.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you'd like to leave our listener with? What's the big picture message you hope they'll remember?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that microplastics are a ubiquitous and persistent problem.
Right.
They're everywhere, and they have the potential to cause harm to both the environment and human health.
Yeah, and while we've focused a lot on the potential risks,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to emphasize that research on microplastics is still a relatively young field.
Right.
There's still much we don't know about their long-term effects and how they interact with our bodies. Right, and it's not a hopeless situation.
Right.
Even though it's a complex issue,
Yeah,
there are things we can do to mitigate the problem.
absolutely. While completely eliminating our exposure to microplastics is likely impossible at this point,
Right.
we can certainly take steps to minimize our contribution to the problem and reduce our individual exposure.
So let's talk solutions.
Yeah.
What are some practical things our listener can do in their daily life to make a difference?
One of the most impactful things we can all do is reduce our reliance on single-use plastics.
Okay.
Those plastic water bottles, straws, grocery bags, takeout containers, they all break down eventually,
Right.
contributing to the microplastic load in the environment.
Yeah. I've definitely been trying to be more mindful of my plastic consumption. I've switched to reusable water bottles and grocery bags,
Good.
and I try to avoid buying products with excessive plastic packaging.
Those are great steps.
Yeah.
And for those times when single-use plastic is unavoidable,
Right.
proper disposal is crucial. Make sure you're recycling plastics whenever possible. And if recycling isn't an option, dispose of them responsibly to prevent them from ending up in the environment.
What about the microplastics that come from our clothes?
Hmm.
You mentioned earlier that synthetic fibers shed microplastics during washing. Any tips for minimizing that?
Washing your clothes less frequently is a good start.
Okay.
And when you do laundry, consider using a microfiber filter.
Okay.
These filters attach to your washing machine's drain hose and can trap some of those tiny plastic particles before they're released into the wastewater.
That's a great tip. I'm going to look into those filters. Are there any other everyday choices we can make to limit our exposure to microplastics?
Choosing filtered tap water over bottled water is another smart move. Studies have shown that bottled water can contain microplastics, so
Right.
sticking with tap water,
Yeah.
especially if you have a good filtration system, is a safer bet.
It's funny how something as simple as filling up a reusable water bottle can actually make a difference.
No, that's up. And these individual choices, when multiplied across millions of people, can have a significant impact.
Any other advice for our listener on the food front? Are there any types of food we should be especially aware of when it comes to microplastic contamination?
This might seem obvious, but try to eat more fresh whole foods and less processed foods.
Right.
Processed foods often come in plastic packaging and may be more likely to contain microplastics.
Right.
Also, be mindful of seafood choices.
Yeah.
Smaller fish that are lower on the food chain tend to accumulate fewer microplastics than larger predatory fish.
So making conscious choices about what we buy, what we eat, and how we care for our clothes can all contribute to a solution.
Exactly. It's about being aware of the problem and taking small steps in our daily lives to minimize our impact.
Yeah, it's empowering to know that we're not powerless in the face of this challenge.
Absolutely. And as research continues to shed light on the risks and solutions associated with microplastics, we'll be better equipped to make informed choices and advocate for policies that protect both human health and the environment.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And I'm sure our listener feels the same way. We've learned so much about microplastics, what they are, where they're found, how they're getting into our bodies,
Right.
and what scientists are investigating regarding their potential health effects. It's clear that there's still a lot to learn about this emerging threat, but it's a conversation we need to keep having.
I couldn't agree more. The more we understand about microplastics and their potential impacts, the better equipped we'll be to navigate this plasticine era and create a healthier future for ourselves and generations to come.
And on that note, we'll leave our listener with his final thought. What legacy do we want to leave for future generations? Do we want to be remembered as the generation that drowned the planet in plastic, or the generation that turned the tide? It's a choice we're making every day. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.